The 1909 Arizona Gazette shock, what was actually printed. 3 headlines did the work before readers even reached the first paragraph. Mysteries of immense rich cavern being brought to light. Jordan is enthused. Remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from Orient. The byline, none. The date, April 5, 1909. The paper, the Arizona Gazette. The story begins with a lone traveler, G.E. Kincaid, drifting down through Marble Canyon toward the heart of the Grand Canyon. He's described as a seasoned riverman with a camera and a rifle scanning cliff faces for mineral stains. According to the article, at roughly 2,000 feet above the river, he notices a dark oval, an opening. He makes landfall, scales the wall, and squeezes into a corridor that gives way to a man-made tunnel, then a system, then a city carved into stone. Inside, the Gazette says, there were passageways running for hundreds of feet, storerooms stacked with what the writer calls granaries, copper tools blackened with age, and urns, some sealed with a resin-like pitch. The centerpiece was a seated figure that Kincaid takes to be an idol. The text uses the language of the day, Oriental, Egyptian, Hindu, as if anything not obviously Euro-American must belong to a single imagined East. It's breathless but specific. The rooms are numbered, the artifacts sorted, the corridors measured, the effort supervised. And then comes the institutional anchor. Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian, we're told, becomes involved, brings expertise, directs an organized excavation. The project shifts from a one-man discovery to a sanctioned dig, and that's where the story plants its biggest stake. It wasn't just a lucky cave. It was a site under management with a pipeline to Washington. There's a second, smaller Gazette item that month, Kincaid reaching Yuma after months on the river, which the big story uses to set a timeline. October to March on the water. Marble Canyon to Yuma. Anyone who's studied the Powell expeditions knows those river miles were survivable with the right craft and nerve. So some logistics check out, at least on paper. But in the big story, where exactly is this supposed complex? The article alludes to elevations, to sheer approach, to a point, from which can be seen certain familiar features, but it dances around coordinates. The specificity retreats when it matters most. Let's talk what's verified. The Arizona Gazette was a real paper. The April 5 story exists in scans and transcripts. The language you've heard paraphrased is traceable. Now the problems. No known Professor S.A. Jordan appears in Smithsonian staff records. And in the 2000s, the Smithsonian clarified for anyone asking. No G.E. Kincaid in their personnel or contractor files, no Professor Jordan, and no accession numbers or catalog entries tied to such a haul from the Grand Canyon. The institution has listed the Kincaid narrative as a recurring myth. Does that end it? Not if you've ever watched how a strong narrative survives fact-checking. The Gazette piece buries hooks. It gives a room count. It lists categories of artifacts. It offers a plausible river route. It claims institutional oversight. Each detail is bait. Debunking one piece doesn't erase the others. Meanwhile, the paper's lack of a byline and its over-the-top cultural framing raise real red flags. A front-page scoop with no credited reporter, repeating era tropes about Oriental origins, and never giving readers a map they could trace. So we test the edges. Could a single river traveler have spotted a high cave in that stretch? Sure, visual anomalies jump out when you've been staring at varnished rock for days. Could a single person access a man-made complex at that elevation without blasting gear or fixed lines? That's harder. The story suggests rope and nerve, but consistent ascents to haul out artifacts would demand logistics beyond a solo run. Could the Smithsonian have quietly backed an excavation and left no paper trace? Their 200s responses point the other way. Standard practice in the 190s meant logging accessions, even imperfectly. A haul of urns and copper tools would leave a catalog shadow. Yet the Gazette's afterlife keeps growing because of something the article never mentioned: the names on the map. You can open a modern USGS sheet and confirm them yourself. Isis Temple, Cheops Pyramid, Tower of Set, Horus Temple, Osiris Temple. They're not fringe labels scrawled by cranks. They're official toponyms adopted and repeated. And when you stack a century of rumor next to a landscape labeled in the language of Egypt, your brain starts stitching a connection the evidence doesn't support. Here's the irony. Those names preceded the Gazette story. Clarence Dutton, working in the 1880s, looked at those buttes and mesas and said they looked like temples and pyramids. He reached for pantheons, Egyptian, Hindu, Norse, Greek, to match the grandeur. Poetic cartography, not proof of contact. But the Gazette, arriving 2 decades later, landed on soil already fertilized with myth. A canyon of temples named for Ra and Isis, made any talk of idols feel less outlandish to a reader who'd never hiked those walls. One more beat. People sometimes say, if it was a hoax, why can't we just go see the cave? Because you can't just go into caves at Grand Canyon National Park. The NPS has long restricted cave access for safety and resource protection, with added urgency around white nose syndrome in bats. All caves closed to the public is standard language. That closure, designed to prevent injuries and ecological damage, also blocks amateur verification. The absence becomes oxygen for an old fire. So what did the Gazette actually give us? A dramatic narrative with enough logistical color to feel grounded, anchored by an institutional name it didn't earn, and launched into a landscape already draped in Egyptian names. If the story is fantasy, the map shouldn't make it feel plausible. But it does, which means we need to separate the poetry from the coordinates before we can say anything honest about a forbidden map. The canyon's Egyptian names, public official hiding in plain sight. Walk your eyes along a modern map and it starts to sound like a museum tour. Isis Temple, Cheops Pyramid, Horus Temple, Osiris Temple, Tower of Set. These aren't fan labels scribbled in pencil, they're official toponyms you can find on USGS quadrangles and National Park Service materials. The names feel like they're winking at the Gazette article, but they were on the landscape, on paper at least, long before 1909. To understand why, we need to go back to a geologist with a poet's ear. In the 1880s, Clarence Dutton surveyed the Grand Canyon and decided plain descriptors weren't enough. The buttes rose like sanctuaries, the strata stacked like steps to the sky, so he borrowed from pantheons. Egyptian, Hindu, Norse, Greek, Dutton thought the forms demanded mythic company. He wasn't smuggling evidence, he was assigning mood. He saw a formation that looked like a pyramid, so Cheops felt right. A butte with the profile of a temple could be Isis or Osiris, without implying a single Nile-born tool touched that stone. Here's why that decision matters. Official names don't just locate things, they tell you how to feel about them. If you call a butte Osiris, you tune public perception before anyone takes a step on the trail. A hiker hears Osiris and thinks old, sacred, foreign. A journalist hears Cheops and thinks Egypt, desert tombs. That's the quiet power of toponyms. They shape the background of our imagination. And once the background is set, a story like the Gazette's feels more plausible than it should. Let's talk sources. You can track these names through USGS map editions, park documents, and early survey reports that adopted Dutton's lexicon. Over time, the list standardized. Some names shifted in prominence, others were fixed early and repeated until they felt inevitable. The canon of Egyptian-named features clusters in the Central Corridor and North Rim vicinity, where those monumental buttes really do read as carved geometry from a distance. The map isn't lying about the shapes. It's just choosing a cultural lens. From a cartographer's point of view in the 1880s, this was normal, almost expected. Across the American West, mappers and explorers reached into classical and mythic vocabularies to elevate landscapes they believed rivaled Europe's antiquities. It was branding before branding had a department. Dutton's choices were celebrated for their lyricism. Reviewers praised the way his nomenclature matched sublimity with story. None of that excuses the consequences a century later, when those same choices become Exhibit A in a case for Egyptian contact. But it explains the origin without dipping into conspiracy. Now there's a human moment buried inside this. Names get field-tested. A ranger points to a formation, a guide repeats it to a group, a hiker brings it home in a story. The repetition cements it. Think about a kid unfolding a park map at dinner and reading Horus Temple aloud. There's no footnote that says, by the way, this doesn't mean Egyptians were here. The map's voice is neutral, so the implication, however unintended, survives the handoff. This is where the stakes rise. If names can tilt interpretation, they can also seed legends. An Osiris across from an Isis frames the canyon as a shrine. Add Cheops, and suddenly pyramids aren't just metaphors, they're prompts. When later storytellers stitch in talk of idols and urns, the landscape has already done half the persuasion. Even skeptics have to admit the symmetry is seductive. It's one thing to say a headline ran wild. It's another to look at Tower of Set on an official sheet and not wonder. We should also be clear on what's not present. The toponyms aren't coordinates to secret entrances. USGS labels tied to visible formations, not cave mouths. The Park Service didn't invent Isis Temple in a back room to mislead anyone. It inherited a lexicon. And if you scan the gazetteers, you'll find pantheons beyond Egypt. Zoroaster, Brahma, Shiva, Wotan, evidence that the impulse was aesthetic range, not coded messaging. Egypt looms larger because, culturally, it looms larger everywhere. Tutmania decades later only amplified what Dutton set in motion. Still, some details refuse to sit quietly. The Egyptian cluster is dense enough that it reads like a theme park zone. Walk one ridge and name after name, the same civilization's gods appear. That density primes certain kinds of map readers to look for patterns, then for patterns inside patterns. And when they do, they don't need forged charts, they need official ones, where the words themselves whisper continuity. So we pause and test. What's the simplest explanation that fits the facts? A 19th century geologist used Old World pantheons to evoke grandeur. Later agencies codified those names, the public internalized them. That's the clean read. But it collides with memory when people encounter the Gazette story. The names don't prove a tunnel system. They do explain why to this day a rumor finds easy footing. The map doesn't just show the canyon, it narrates it softly in a borrowed tongue. And that borrowed tongue won't be the last time cartographers shape the story more than they realize. Because if naming can open a door in your head, editing can close one on paper. Cartographers and the 190s naming craze, context versus conspiracy. While those names were echoing through the canyon, something else was happening across the West. Mapmakers were on a binge. Greek peaks, Norse mesas, Hindu buttes, Egyptian temples, romance on paper. It wasn't secret code, it was a style. The 1880s set the tone, and the early 1900s kept riffing, locking a poetic vocabulary into official sheets. Clarence Dutton sits at the center of this. He wasn't hiding messages, he was staging a chorus. In his mind, sublime forms deserved sublime references. If a butte looked like a ziggurat, he reached for deities. If it felt like a sanctuary, he borrowed a temple. Meanwhile, USGS staffers who admired his prose absorbed his lexicon. The habit spread because it worked. People remembered it. Rangers repeated it. Publishers loved it. Here's where motive matters. You can name a wall Cheops for drama, or you can name it Cheops to hint at a buried civilization. The first motive is on the page in Dutton's writing: metaphor, grandeur, lyric reach. The second would require private notes, side letters, knowing winks that never show up. We've looked for those breadcrumbs. What appears instead are field notes about skyline profiles, shaded relief, and how certain angles suggest stacked masonry. Aesthetic judgment, not archaeological signaling. But there's a rub. Once a pattern hardens, later caretakers can inherit more than names. They inherit connotations. A 190s editor deciding whether to standardize Horus Temple isn't weighing ancient contact. They're weighing consistency with earlier additions. The decision is bureaucratic. The effect, unintended or not, is cumulative, a dense mythic district that reads like a theme. Let's pressure test the conspiracy frame anyway. If someone wanted to flag hidden sites through names, you'd expect a few tells. Clusters keyed to precise coordinates, quiet renamings when attention spiked, private correspondence linking features to restricted areas. What we can confirm are clusters, because the landforms themselves cluster. The Egyptian set sits where the topography most resembles staged architecture. We do see small renamings over decades, but they track normalization, not hush. And private letters. The ones that surface discuss print runs, typographic errors, and which variant won the board vote. Meanwhile, across Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming, Greek and Norse names stack up with the same zeal. Nobody's arguing Athens colonized arches or Odin shaped the Uintas. The pattern is the point, a fashion that outlived its originator because it made maps sing. That doesn't absolve the downstream confusion, it explains the upstream choice. Get this, there's a human quirk that keeps the confusion alive. Once a person believes the names are signals, every neutral decision becomes suspicious. A missing diacritic, clean up to them, a dropped label in a later edition, redaction, a new trail that skirts a butte named for set, cover, route. Confirmation bias tightens the knot. The more ordinary the cause, the more intentional it looks. Now remember, this is the 1900s, so standardized mapping is accelerating. Lithography improves, revisions cycle faster, committees replace lone poets. Dutton's flourish becomes institutional habit. In that shift, intent evaporates. You're left with outcomes. And those outcomes, Egypt clustered in a few spectacular districts, prime a century of readers to stitch fantasy to form. Here's where it gets interesting. One detail still won't sit neatly. Some editions show minor placement shifts or altered feature prominence around the Egyptian cluster. Nothing dramatic, but enough that treasure hunters pin screenshots and swear something moved. When we trace the edits, the boring reasons usually win. Better survey control, updated contours, a Cardo pass that favored clarity over density. But the fact that these tweaks concentrate where names are most magnetic keeps the debate alive. The map didn't cause the myth, It refuses to kill it. So context or conspiracy? The clean read points to context. A romantic naming convention canonized by USGS practice, echoed by rangers, loved by readers. No hidden dossier, no cipher. And yet, because names shape expectation, they keep feeding the loop. The canyon's Egyptian vocabulary builds a stage set. The 1909 headline supplies a script. Viewers fill the seats. Everything was about to feel settled. Just aesthetics, nothing more, until we step off paper and into policy. Because while the labels were becoming poetry, doors on the ground were starting to close. And edits on a map can feel like mood, but a locked gate feels like intent. Missing corridors, closed caves, permits, and safety. While the labels were poetry, the ground was getting rules. In the Grand Canyon, you can't just duck into a hole in the wall because a rumor says treasure waits inside. The park's position is blunt. All caves are closed to the public. Not most. All. If you want to enter, you need to qualify for research access, then navigate a permit process that asks what you'll do, why you need to do it there, and how you'll protect what's inside. The stated reasons aren't exotic. Safety, resource protection, cultural respect, and disease mitigation. The park repeats the language like a mantra because it's the policy spine across the system. Caves break ankles and backs. They swallow the unprepared. And their ecological vaults, fragile chambers that store life histories in dripstone and guano, in pale bones and silent air. Add one more modern pressure. White nose syndrome, a fungal disease that's devastated bat populations across regions. The response is standardized. Limit human vectors, close openings, decontaminate gear, keep bat colonies from collapse. From a desk, that reads as uncontroversial. On a trail, it reads like a locked door where a story says there should be an entrance. That gap between policy and curiosity is where the conspiracy fog rolls in. People send FOIA requests that mix earnest questions with fevered claims. One asks for the key to open a door in the Grand Canyon Pyramid. Another demands the coordinates of the Egyptian cavern. The replies don't indulge the fantasy. They cite the rules. No such records, cave closures, safety priorities. Bureaucratic sentences meet campfire questions, and neither side changes vocabulary. Here's the tension we have to hold without flinching. Restriction creates a vacuum. In a park this large, with walls this sheer and history this deep, nobody can personally verify most of it. You can raft a week and never pass within eyeshot of a posted sign. So when a rumor promises a sealed corridor above a named butte, the posted closure isn't just a boundary, it's a plot device. Why is it closed? Becomes, what are they hiding? And because the NPS answer rarely changes, safety, resources, bats, the steady rationale sounds, to some ears, like scripted denial. Let's ground this in what's actually documented. The park states all caves closed to the public, full stop, and prioritizes public safety and disease prevention. That's on brand with other cave parks where access is also heavily managed. Research permits exist. Teams go in with protocols, with plans, with decon. If you want to test a legend responsibly, the route is tedious by design. It forces you into the same cadence as scientists and cultural monitors. You don't get to sprint past gatekeeping because your hunch feels cinematic. Meanwhile, there's a layer that never makes the tabloid beat: cultural protection. The canyon isn't an empty museum. It's a living homeland for Hopi, Havasupai, Hualapai, Navajo, Zuni, and others. Some places are sacred. Some stories have protocols. When closures align with sites of cultural significance, the point isn't to frustrate explorers. It's to prevent a different kind of injury. Who decides what gets sealed? Not one agency in a vacuum. Decisions braid together park managers, tribal governments, biologists, archaeologists, and risk officers. The meeting notes won't read like cliffhanger chapters. They'll read like calendars and constraints. But here's where pattern hunters grab hold. The places that feel most mythic already, those temple-like districts with Egyptian names, often overlap with the toughest terrain and sensitive resources. Sheer approaches, unstable ceilings, active bat roosts, known archaeological scatters nearby. String those together and the map of hard to get in starts to look like a map of kept from knowing. That's confirmation bias with a canyon backdrop. The hazard and the legend sit in the same room, and you decide which one's louder. There's another human moment worth sitting with. A ranger opens their inbox to find a request that starts with genuine curiosity and ends with a demand for access to a forbidden cave. They've got 3 rescues on the board from last month, a wildfire pre-planned meeting at 2 and a bat survey at 4. Their reply is going to be short and template-driven because the inbox never sleeps. All caves closed, research permits required, safety and resource protection. To the sender, it can feel like a stone wall. To the ranger, it's triage. Now, does any of this prove or disprove a hidden complex above Marble Canyon? No, it explains why the rumor stays supple. The gate isn't performative, it's protective. The policy isn't a wink, it's a shield for biology, for culture, and for people who underestimate limestone. And yet the perception of secrecy thrives because access isn't frictionless, and the backstory, Egyptian names, a century-old headline, begs for friction. So how do you chase truth without stomping what you claim to value? You build the long path. You partner with tribes from the outset. You design a research question that passes muster with archaeologists and biologists. You accept that some answers live behind no for reasons that matter more than your curiosity. You don't kick down doors, literal or metaphorical. Everything about this next step is slower than a rumor wants it to be. But if you're serious, it's the only step that doesn't end with a closed gate and a louder story. While the park was tightening gates, the institution at the center of the Gazette claim was answering emails. The Smithsonian's replies in the 2000s were short, consistent, and for many infuriating. No records for a GE Kincaid in personnel or contractor files. No Prof. S.A. Jordan in any staff directory. No accession numbers, no catalog cards, no field notes, no publications, no collections tied to a Grand Canyon haul that looked anything like urns, copper tools, or an idol. In plain speak, nothing in the archive that fits the story. Here's why that matters. Museums don't just store objects, they store paper about objects. In the 1900s, the Smithsonian, like other major institutions, used accession ledgers to log incoming material. An accession creates a paper trail, date, source, description, quantity, and a number that travels with every later mention. If a shipment of Egyptian-style urns and copper implements ever landed on a Smithsonian loading dock, standard practice meant a ledger entry, then a set of catalog cards, then ideally a mention in a departmental report. Even sloppy record-keeping leaves shreds. A big, photogenic, politically touchy haul, that tends to leave more, not less. When the institution says, no accession, they aren't only saying there's no Kincaid box on a shelf. They're saying the scaffolding around a discovery, letters, internal memos, shipping forms doesn't show up where it should. People write back, maybe they destroyed it. Possible, theoretically. But destruction leaves shadows too, closed files, restricted entries, gaps that archivists flag. The Smithsonian's public-facing Mythbuster pages treat the Gazette story as a recurring inquiry, not a restricted topic. That tone is telling. Let's step inside the workflow so we're not guessing. A legitimate field discovery in the 1900s would move through a few predictable channels. A field investigator or partner notifies a department head. The head approves an acquisition, often by committee. A registrar assigns an accession number. Curators and catalogers create descriptive records. If the material is sensational, public affairs coordinates messaging. That pipeline creates redundant documentation. When weird one-off gifts arrive without context, the objects can lurk in limbo. But the Gazette describes an excavation under the direction of a Smithsonian figure. That's the opposite of limbo. Directed work tends to create paper density. The counter-argument goes like this. What if Kincaid isn't a staffer, Jordan isn't a staffer, but a third party shipped a crate with a cover letter that got misfiled? Even then, disaggregated paperwork reveals itself over time. Researchers stumble into misfiled notes, registrars reconcile orphaned objects. The Smithsonian's consistent answer across the 2000s, after multiple independent inquiries, is that none of these threads exist for this story. That doesn't prove a negative in the cosmic sense. It shows an absence where a presence should be obvious. There's a human reaction we have to name. People hear no records and translate it to cover-up, especially when the subject touches national myth and ancient mystery. But archivists aren't gate dragons, they're pattern readers. They see the heartbeat of a real provenance, a returning name, a repeat address, a courier slip that recurs. They also see the noise, forgeries, misattributions, patriotic donations of random rocks labeled from Atlantis. The Gazette account, when mapped against institutional rhythm, doesn't hum, it floats. Now the denials also do something else. They push the burden of proof off the Smithsonian and back onto provenance. If the institution has no paper, what would a researcher need to show to restart the conversation? 3 things minimum. First, a document with contemporaneous origin, a 190s letter, a diary entry, a shipping bill tied to a real sender with traceable identity. Second, corroboration from another archive, a park ledger, a river permit, a railroad freight record, something that stakes a place and a date. Third, physical evidence with chain of custody, an object whose material analysis and documented history can survive peer review. Without those, you aren't asking the Smithsonian to correct a filing error. You're asking it to manifest a ghost. Meanwhile, the absence has effects. Conspiracy podcasts hold up no accession like a magician's veil. See, they admit nothing. And yet, if you listen to internal museum folks talk off mic about this rumor, the tone isn't sinister. It's weary. They get asked about Kincaid annually. Some keep form replies handy because the inquiry cadence never slows. The myth generates administrative work which hardens the form replies which feeds the myth. A tidy loop. Let's add one complication we can't ignore. The lack of Smithsonian records doesn't erase the broader archaeological footprint of the canyon. There are registered sites, documented collections, reports in journals, none of them Egyptian, all of them part of a deep human timeline rooted in indigenous presence. This matters. Myths can erase real histories by drowning them out with imported fantasies. When agencies and tribes say no to casual cave entry, they aren't defending a secret pharaoh. They're defending actual, documented heritage from damage and theft. So where does that leave us with a clean assignment? Stop asking the Smithsonian to confess to a ledger that doesn't exist. Start asking smarter questions of archives that do. Freight logs, surveyor notebooks, early park correspondence, local newspapers beyond one headline. If there's a thread, it won't begin in Washington. It will begin in the canyon's own paper wake. And if nothing surfaces, then the denials aren't a wall. They're a map of where not to keep digging. The work shifts from chasing a phantom to understanding why that phantom keeps walking. The letter trail, rumor management inside agencies. While archives in Washington were saying no records, inboxes in Arizona were learning a new rhythm. Answer the Egypt question without feeding it. You can hear the cadence in agency emails and interoffice memos.